So let's imagine a very precise example. Here we've got the Prime Minister. He flies around the world in a Challenger jet. They're produced here in Canada, at least parts of them anyway, by Bombardier. Now I think it's Airbus. So how does he get a hold of this plane? By the way, the plane is about $35–40 million. So it's a very good example. The Canadian economy, Canadian workers produce this plane, and the government wants it. Prime Minister wants it. So once again, to pay for the plane, the Prime Minister has one of three choices. He can either tax people, he can borrow and buy the plane, or he can print new money. He has no secret stash. He can't have the plane made for him. Well, what is a tax? As I said, the plane costs about $35 million, let's say. He could take $1 from every Canadian and buy the plane. How would he do this? Well, quite literally, he could go into the bank account of every Canadian and take $1 from it. That's what a tax is. It's not voluntary. Of course, more likely, he might take $20 from one person, $3 from somebody else, and pay for it that way. Of course, another extreme example, he could go to the factory north of Montreal and simply say, that plane over there, I'm taking it. It's mine. And that illustrates more clearly what a tax is and why it's real. This may sound strange. Can a government actually do that? Well, in fact, it does. Canada doesn't, but in the United States did it up until 1971. Countries in the world still do it. Israel does it. Switzerland does it. It's called military service. And typically it applies only to young men. I think in the case of Israel is both young men and young women. In the case of Switzerland, even older men have to go to military service. It's an example of a tax. Now, what about borrowing? Well, I want to take a bit of time here to explain how governments borrow. The way they do this is they print a special type of paper. It's called a bond. Often it's got fancy writing. Here you've got an example to see what they look like, the ones in Canada. I call it an IOU. What it says is that it will promise to pay, the government, signed by Justin Trudeau, promise to pay $100 1 year in the future. These bonds have different names. Sometimes they're known as a promissory note, bond, commercial, a whole bunch of, I'm going to call it a bond, government bond. And the question is, how much would you pay for this piece of paper today? Well, you're going to receive $100 next year, so you certainly wouldn't pay more than $100 now. Let's say for the sake of argument, I'm willing to give $90 now. Keep in mind, this is voluntary. I give $90 to Justin Trudeau. He gives me this IOU and promising to give me $100 next year. If the government can sell sufficient of these bonds, collect the $90 from a bunch of people, they'll have the money, go out and buy the plane. What's the problem that the government's going to face with the Prime Minister? Well, next year on the 30th of April, he's going to have $100 for each one of these bits of paper, these bonds that he sold. So in this case, it becomes a future tax. So I refer to the printing of bonds as a future tax. We've got a real tax in the sense of taking money from people now, or voluntary borrowing, but it just puts off the issue next year. Now, what about printing? Third possibility, you could print money. This one's kind of interesting. I want to look at it this way. Imagine we've got $20 cash, blank piece of paper, and I got a cheap watch that's $30. If I destroy the $30 watch, I throw it on the ground and just break it, well, I lose $30. What does anybody else in the world lose? Well, nothing. It's not their watch. What does the world lose? Well, the world just lost a $30 watch. What happens if I take a blank piece of paper, it's mine, I burn it? Well, what is a blank piece of paper? 1 cent, 2 cents? What is the rest of anybody else? Well, they don't lose anything. And what did the world? Well, a blank piece of paper, which is basically worth nothing, zero. What about $20 cash? Imagine I've got $20 cash and I burn that. Well, I'm going to lose 20 bucks. But what did the world lose? Well, cash is no different than a blank piece of paper. The world didn't lose anything. This is something that's very hard for people to understand. But what we can understand is if you add up the first two rows, you get the bottom row. So minus 30 plus 0 is minus 30. 0 plus 0 is equal to 0. Minus 20 plus what gives us 0? Well, it means everybody else must gain $20. All right, what does this mean? Well, let's take this from another perspective. Here I got a map of Canada. I'm going to divide it in two. All right, there we go. Now, imagine that, I don't know, everybody west of that line west of Winnipeg, wakes up tomorrow morning, and when they look in their wallet, they got blank pieces of paper out of invisible ink. The money just disappeared. It's just white paper. Everybody east of Winnipeg wakes up and they still have money. Well, what can you understand very quickly is that I'd rather be on the eastern side of the line because my money will still have value. People on the western side will just have blank pieces of paper. But there's more than that. What we can say also is that the stores in Canada still have all the same stuff in them. What's different now is my paper on the eastern side of this line will have more value. It will increase in value. So this is the sense of if a way to think about it is imagine Bill Gates, 50, 60 billion dollars, I don't know what he's got. If he took all his money, all of his ownings, his assets, converted it to cash and burned the money, he would lose 50, 60 billion. But who would gain? Well, anybody holding on to US dollars when he does that, because the value of their money would increase. What this means is that if the government, if Trudeau were to print up $35, $40 million extra and use it to buy a Zoo airplane, well, anybody holding Canadian dollars when he did this would see the value of their money go down a little bit. And we refer to this as the inflation tax. So in effect, what this means is if the government wants to have a new plane, they can tax people now. They can borrow, voluntary, and get the plane that way, but it's just a future tax. The third possibility is print new money, and well, that's called the inflation tax, because anybody holding money when that happens will see the value decrease. Now, what this also means is that some taxes are better than others. Generally speaking, economists agree that the worst tax of all is the inflation tax. It's debilitating in the sense that it's a bit secret, not obvious, and people with money falls in value. How do you avoid this inflation? Nobody likes paying taxes. How do you avoid it? Well, spend the money. Some famous examples of this inflation tax being applied is after almost all revolutions, American, Chinese, Russia, at that time, nobody wants to pay normal taxes. Governments can't borrow because nobody wants to own their bonds. So typically after a revolution, the new government, the only way they can finance their purchases is through printing new money, and that leads to inflation. Another famous example is Germany in the 1920s, after the First World War, referred to as the Weimar Republic, had severe inflation. I think I've provided a link to Zimbabwe in 1990. There's an interesting article to read what happened there. Argentina, under several times, has gone through various types of reform, typically caused by the fact that the government relies on printing new money for its purchases. I want to finish with two last points. They're important. Something called seigniorage. It is true, nonetheless, that a government can print money without provoking inflation. And way to imagine this is every day in Canada, new immigrants arrive. And these people that arrive, well, they have to have some cash in their pockets. I don't know, the average Canadian may have $100, $200. Students typically have much less. And of course, with credit cards now and debit cards and things, people don't rely on cash as much as they did before. But because of this, the Canadian government can print new money and in effect sell it to people that will need it and hold it, and this does not cause inflation. This is referred to as seigniorage. So it means to be able to add money. It's a nice source of income for the federal government, by the way, adding new money to the economy without provoking any inflation. Last little point too about bond prices. Watch this one. I'm going to come back to this one again. But I said before, a typical bond has what's called a face value, promises to pay $100 in the future. And I said, well, let's say I pay $90 for it today, and wait 1 year, and I receive $100. That means to say I'm going to get like a $10 extra profit. If, on the other hand, somebody decides only to pay $70 today for this bond, I don't know what prices people are going to pay. I certainly wouldn't pay more than $100. But let's say somebody pays $70. In that case, the extra return you're going to get is $30. There's your first little lesson in finance, is the higher the bond price, the lower the interest rate or the lower return.